The hum of engines echoed through the cabin as Flight 302 leveled off at cruising altitude. The passengers settled into their seats, a mix of weary travelers and eager adventurers. Amelia Carter glanced out the window, watching the clouds streak by in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was her first international trip as a journalist, and her nerves were a mix of excitement and apprehension. She flipped open her notebook, jotting down details about the diverse passengers she had observed during boarding. The businessman furiously typing on his laptop, the elderly couple holding hands, the young mother soothing a fussy toddler. Each person was a story waiting to be told. Captain James Adler's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Weather ahead looks clear, and we're expecting a smooth flight to Paris. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." His reassuring tone put the passengers at ease, and a few exchanged smiles. Amelia's attention shifted to the flight attendants making their rounds with the beverage cart. She accepted a cup of coffee and leaned back, letting the warmth of the cup steady her nerves. The faint smell of jet fuel mingled with the aroma of brewed coffee and reheated meals. The routine of air travel had a strange comfort to it, as though it were a ritual shared by millions worldwide. Halfway through her coffee, Amelia's gaze drifted to the seatback screen in front of her. The flight tracker showed their position over the Atlantic Ocean, a tiny plane icon surrounded by an endless expanse of blue. She thought about how, from this height, the world seemed boundless and serene. But the calm was deceptive, hiding the immense power of nature below. A sudden jolt shook the cabin, startling Amelia and several others. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane rocked again. Amelia's heart raced as she gripped the armrests, her coffee spilling onto the tray table. The businessman beside her cursed under his breath, hastily shutting his laptop. Flight attendants moved swiftly, their expressions calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence," Captain Adler announced. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The turbulence worsened, and the plane seemed to drop momentarily before stabilizing. Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin. Amelia tried to focus on her breathing, forcing herself to stay calm. She glanced at the flight attendants, who continued to reassure passengers and secure loose items. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the hum of the engines faltered. The cabin grew eerily quiet for a few seconds before the engines roared back to life. The flight tracker on Amelia's screen froze, the tiny plane icon hovering in place. Anxiety spread through the cabin like wildfire, and Amelia's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Captain Adler and First Officer Elena Vasquez exchanged uneasy glances in the cockpit. The instruments were behaving erratically, and several warning lights blinked on the control panel. Adler's hands moved swiftly over the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft. "What the hell is going on?" Adler muttered. "Do we have any weather anomalies nearby?" Vasquez shook her head, her eyes scanning the radar screen. "Nothing. It's clear skies for miles. But these readings, they don't make sense. Altimeter's jumping, and we've lost GPS." Adler nodded grimly. "Switch to manual. Let's get on the horn with air traffic control." Vasquez tried to hail the nearest ATC, but all she got was static. No response. "It's like we're cut off." A chill ran down Adler's spine. The last thing any pilot wanted was to lose contact over the ocean. He glanced out the cockpit window, but there was nothing to see except the endless expanse of sky and sea. The sun was setting, casting a dim, golden glow over the horizon. Yet, something felt off. "Let's descend to a lower altitude," Adler decided. "Maybe we can pick up a signal there." The descent was smooth at first, but then the controls started to resist. It was as though the plane itself was fighting them. The warning alarms grew louder, and the airspeed indicator fluctuated wildly. Adler tightened his grip on the yoke, his knuckles white. "This doesn't make sense," Vasquez whispered, her voice tinged with fear. The cabin intercom buzzed, and Adler pressed the button. "Flight attendants, prepare for an emergency descent. Passengers, remain seated and follow instructions." In the cabin, Amelia felt her stomach lurch as the plane dipped. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers, and panic began to set in. She heard a child crying and a man praying aloud. Despite her fear, Amelia's journalist instincts kicked in. She grabbed her notebook and began scribbling furiously, capturing every detail. The flickering lights, the strained voices, the metallic groan of the plane. It all felt surreal. Then, without warning, the plane leveled off and the turbulence ceased. The silence was deafening. Amelia looked around, her heart pounding. The flight tracker screen now displayed nothing but static, and the cabin lights dimmed to an eerie glow. Captain Adler's voice returned, strained but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing an anomaly. Please remain seated." An anomaly. The word hung heavy in the air, unanswered questions swirling in Amelia's mind. What could cause such a sudden and unexplainable disruption? And, more importantly, where were they now? The eerie silence hung over the cabin like a dense fog, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. Amelia could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness, a steady drum that reminded her she was alive, even if the situation felt like a dream or a nightmare. She scanned the faces around her, each one etched with varying degrees of fear and confusion. The elderly woman across the aisle clutched her husband's hand, her knuckles white. The young mother held her child tightly, murmuring a soft lullaby in a trembling voice. Amelia's hands shook as she gripped her pen, her notebook now filled with jagged, frantic notes. The flight attendants moved with practiced calm, but even they couldn't hide the tension in their eyes. One of them, a woman with a blonde bun and a name tag that reads Claire, knelt beside a passenger who was hyperventilating. Her soothing words barely registered in the growing murmur of uncertainty that filled the cabin. Amelia's eyes darted to the window. The once vivid sunset was now a dull haze, the horizon blurred and indistinct. Something was wrong with the sky. It wasn't just the color, a muted mix of gray and gold that seemed unnatural, but the way it seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. The clouds twisted and churned in slow motion, forming shapes that dissolved before her eyes could fully register them. She blinked, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. In the cockpit, Adler and Vasquez were locked in a silent battle with the controls. The plane's instruments continued to defy logic, the dials spinning and screens flashing erratic data. The radar was useless, showing only static. Vasquez's fingers flew over the controls, trying every protocol they had been trained for, but nothing worked. "We need to try contacting someone again," Adler said, his voice tight. "This can't be a total blackout." Vasquez nodded and reached for the radio, but as she did, a low-frequency hum filled the cockpit. It wasn't coming from the plane. It was external, a deep vibration that resonated in their bones. Adler's hand froze on the yoke as he exchanged a wide-eyed look with Vasquez. The hum grew louder, a sound that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the air around them. In the cabin, the passengers heard it too. Heads turned, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The sound was unlike anything they had ever experienced, a mix of a whale's call, a tuning fork, and something utterly alien. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a sound that seemed to demand attention. Then, the lights in the cabin flickered again, and the plane shuddered. Amelia felt a sudden weightlessness, her stomach flipping as if the aircraft had dropped slightly. She gripped the edge of her seat, her breath catching in her throat. The strange hum was now accompanied by a faint glow outside the windows, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to surround the plane. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice breaking the tense silence. Amelia leaned closer to the window, her journal forgotten in her lap. The glow intensified, shifting colors like a living aurora. It was mesmerizing, but it also filled her with a deep sense of dread. She turned to the businessman beside her, his face pale as he stared out his own window. He met her gaze and shook his head, as if to say, "I don't know." The intercom crackled, and Adler's voice came through, strained and uneven. "Ladies and gentlemen, we don't know what's happening. Please remain calm. We're doing everything we can to ensure your safety." The reassurance did little to quell the rising panic. A man in the back of the cabin stood up, shouting questions that no one could answer. A flight attendant hurried to calm him, her own composure fraying at the edges. Amelia's pulse raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. The hum, the light, the distorted sky. It all felt impossible, as though they had left the realm of reality. Without warning, the plane jolted violently, throwing Amelia against her seatbelt. The lights went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Screams erupted, and Amelia's own voice joined them before she could stop herself. The hum outside grew louder, almost deafening, and then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The plane stabilized, the lights flickered back on, and the glow outside the windows vanished. The cabin was silent, save for the sobs and gasps of the passengers. Amelia's hands trembled as she fumbled for her notebook. She needed to document this, to anchor herself in the act of writing. But when she looked at the page, the words she had written before were gone, replaced by a single phrase scrawled in handwriting that wasn't hers. "You are not alone." The air inside the cabin was heavy with tension as passengers whispered nervously among themselves. Amelia sat frozen in her seat, her eyes fixed on the words in her notebook. "You are not alone." The phrase seemed to pulse on the page, the ink darker than it should have been. She closed the notebook with trembling hands, unsure if she had imagined it all. Captain Adler's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are attempting to establish communication with ground control. Please remain calm and stay seated. We will provide updates as soon as possible." His tone carried the weight of a man trying to stay composed in the face of the inexplicable. In the cockpit, Adler and Vasquez were no closer to understanding what had just occurred. The instruments, which had gone completely dark moments earlier, now displayed normal readings. The radar showed their position as stationary, suspended over a featureless void. There were no stars, no ocean, nothing, just an infinite black expanse. Adler's hand hovered over the throttle, unsure of whether to trust the controls or abandon them altogether. "We need to try something," Vasquez said, breaking the silence. "If we can't move forward, maybe we should ascend or descend. Anything to see if it changes our position." Adler nodded and gently eased the yoke forward, initiating a slow descent. The altimeter responded, numbers ticking downward, but the void outside remained unchanged. It was as though the plane was trapped in a bubble, disconnected from reality. Adler exhaled sharply and pulled the yoke back, returning to their original altitude. "Still nothing," he muttered. "It's like we're nowhere." A sudden flicker of light outside the cockpit window caught their attention. Vasquez leaned forward, her breath hitching as she squinted into the darkness. The light grew brighter, taking on a swirling, organic shape. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a luminous, pulsating entity that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. It hovered silently, its movements fluid and deliberate. "What is that?" Vasquez whispered, her voice barely audible. Adler shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the mesmerizing sight. The entity emitted a faint hum, the same sound they had heard earlier. It seemed to resonate within the very structure of the plane, vibrating through every bolt and rivet. The light intensified, and for a moment, Adler felt as though the entity was watching them. In the cabin, the passengers reacted to the growing light outside. Some clung to each other, while others stared in awe. Amelia pressed her face to the window, her heart pounding as the entity came into view. It was both beautiful and terrifying, its shifting form defying comprehension. She fumbled for her notebook again, determined to document every detail. The light outside grew blinding, forcing the passengers to shield their eyes. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the entity seemed to implode, collapsing into a single point of light before vanishing entirely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, once more, save for the dim emergency lights overhead. The silence that followed was deafening. Amelia looked around, her mind racing. "What just happened?" she whispered to herself. She turned to the businessman beside her, but he simply shook his head, his face pale and drawn. The young mother across the aisle held her child tightly, tears streaming down her face. In the cockpit, Adler and Vasquez struggled to process what they had witnessed. The instruments remained stable, and the radar now displayed a single, blinking, a sign of land. Adler's hands tightened on the controls as he adjusted their heading toward the signal. Whatever that was, it's gone now. Let's get these people home, he said, his voice resolute. The passengers felt the shift in the plane's trajectory and braced themselves. Amelia glanced at her notebook again, half expecting the mysterious phrase to reappear. Instead, the pages were blank, as though everything she had written had been erased. She gritted her teeth and closed the notebook, resolving to remember every moment of this experience. As the plane moved closer to the signal, the void outside began to change. The blackness gave way to faint outlines of clouds and a dimly glowing horizon. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin as the familiar sight of the ocean appeared below. The passengers clapped and cheered, their fear giving way to hope. Adler and Vasquez exchanged a glance, their tension easing slightly. "We're back," Vasquez said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. The radar confirmed their position over the Atlantic, just a few hundred miles from their original flight path. It was as though they had been plucked from existence and then returned without explanation. The intercom crackled as Adler addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we've regained our bearings and are on course to Paris. We'll be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." The cabin erupted in applause, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. She stared out the window, her thoughts racing. The entity, the hum, the phrase in her notebook, what did it all mean? She couldn't help but feel that their journey had touched something beyond human understanding. As the plane descended toward the lights of Paris, Amelia made a silent promise to uncover the truth. Whatever had happened to Flight 302, it was a story that demanded to be told.